How is everybody doing? Having a good time so far at Paleo FX? Right on. Good. Well, welcome to the Paleo Magazine stage. And the guy I have here needs no introduction, but I'll go ahead and do that anyway. Robb Wolf is a co-founder of North Cal Strength and Conditioning, and he's the CEO of City Zero and the New York Times best-selling author of the Paleo Solution. Robb's talk is on ketogenic diets for traumatic brain injury, keeping the baby with the bathwater. And I have to say, I requested to MC this because as a former football player who may or may not have suffered concussions during my playing time, because that was back in the day when you were just told to shake it off, suck it up, and get back in the game, as long as you were somewhat cognizant. This is something that myself and guys that I played with really have to deal with, and we really watch each other to make sure that we're not sliding or there's other issues coming about. So without further ado, Robb Wolf.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay, last year I was like a animal caught in a trap with, with this thing flapping around and just all kinds of craziness going on. So, the idea for this talk has been kind of, I guess, kind of multifactorial, working with the Naval Special Warfare community, interacting with the SEALs and special boat team members, doing the work that we do with police, military, and fire, having a very good friend of mine, John Wellborn, who's a 10-year NFL veteran. The kind of issues around traumatic brain injury and then just brain health in general is a really big topic. There was the United States Brain Health Initiative that was launched maybe last year. Lots of money being pumped into looking at things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, which I think is great, but I think that this ancestral health model, again, is a really important piece of the picture that should be front and center when we talk about all this. So if folks don't know what a traumatic brain injury is, it's a bump, impact, or penetrating injury to the brain. That's one potential feature of a traumatic brain injury. So you think about like a rock or a stick hitting the skull and causing kind of a point impact, focal brain damage due to contact injuries, contusions, lacerations. Another way, which oddly enough, I learned from Dr. Kirk Parsley, that things as seemingly benign as a roller coaster ride can actually cause low-grade traumatic brain injury in folks. So there's actually a variety of things beyond the norm that can actually cause traumatic brain injury. Yeah, that's just phenomenal. So in addition to that point impact traumatic brain injury, we can have an acceleration or deceleration injury. And that's where you get diffuse brain damage due to the accelerative nature of the brain basically getting sloshed around inside the cranium. You get all kinds of swelling as some of the consequence of that. The primary insults initially, and I'm not going to go super deep on the pathophysiology on this stuff, but it's interesting to kind of understand the etiology that associates a traumatic brain injury, because it starts looking a lot like other brain issues that we see. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, we see a lot of oxidative damage, we see substrate depletion, and neuronal death, which is ultimately kind of the big problems that we see. So the primary insults, we see a decreased cerebral blood flow. That leads to decreased substrate delivery. So we're not providing oxygen, we're not providing glucose primarily to the brain. And what that leads to is an ischemic-like event. So if you've ever been sitting with your legs crossed and you stand up and you get those pinprick type thing and your leg feels like it's going to kind of fall off, there's actually a lot of reactive oxygen species and a lot of tissue damage that can occur in that event. That's not such a big deal when it happens in your leg and you go from sitting to standing. It's a really big issue when that happens in your brain as a consequence to either metabolic issues or some sort of a traumatic injury. So we get an increased concentration of lactic acid in the brain, and I'll show a diagram here in a little bit. I'm not going to go fully Matt Lalonde on you guys and do the full treatment of like integrated fuel metabolism today, but everybody's familiar with a glycolytic process of converting glucose into energy. One of those steps, we can either plug a glucose substrate into the Krebs cycle, or we can reduce that agent into lactic acid and try to drive some energy forward. But the lactic acid concentration going up leads to substrate depletion and inadequate aerobic metabolism. So we're not providing the basic substrates that are necessary for the brain to survive and to maintain normal homeostasis. We get decreased ATP, we get a loss of membrane potential with resultant edema. So normally what we see in a traumatic brain injury is an initial decrease in blood flow to the brain, and then we see a increase or hyperperfusion to the brain, which ends up having its own kind of bag of difficulties. We have a situation called terminal membrane depolarization. So the way that our nervous system, the way that our muscles work is by creating membrane potentials. We pump calcium and sodium and potassium to different compartments of the cell, and we create these gradients, and it's the flow of these ions through the gradients that drive the work in the cell and keep the cells alive. If we lose that gradient, then the cell is at a very high potentiality for dying, and that's the loss of this terminal membrane depolarization. A ton of excitatory neurotransmitters are released, and this has the effect of increasing reactive oxygen species, increasing the concentration of free radicals in the brain, and ultimately this leads to apoptosis, which is cell death. And if there's one place in our body that we really don't want a significant amount of cell death, it's in the brain. We really don't want it much of anywhere, but that's some place that you really don't bounce back from very effectively. So the mechanical and chemical considerations, we have some initial hypoperfusion due to structural damage. If somebody's head has been sloshed around due to an impact, you can actually get severing or damage to the vasculature of the brain, in addition to these secondary chemical characteristics of decreased substrate utilization and the eventual burnout on that side. We lead into some hyperperfusion, increased intracranial pressure. If anybody's familiar with someone who's had a traumatic brain injury and they get a pressure bolt put in the skull to help relieve pressure that's building up, this is some of the kind of secondary treatment, and then apoptosis. So this is just kind of a condensation of the other slides that we looked at. So the inflammation, like I said, is similar to an ischemic reperfusion injury. I had a friend of mine who was doing his PhD trying to figure out ways of finding molecules that would attach to tissue in transplant situations that was carrying different antioxidants like melatonin or glutathione. And so there was this hope that they would be able to find some sort of an organic chemistry solution to these ischemic reperfusion injuries. It's a really big deal, and a lot of the damage that occurs in tissue transplantation, and then also clearly in this traumatic brain injury situation, is due to actually trying to get the metabolic machinery going again. So TBI morbidity and mortality, this stuff is straight out of like the Centers for Disease Control website. In 2010, there were about 2.5 emergency room visits in the United States. TBIs contribute to the deaths of more than 50,000 people in the United States alone. 280,000 hospitalizations. Let's see here. 2009, an estimated almost 250,000 children were admitted to emergency departments with traumatic brain injury. So it's a really big problem. These are just the folks that are actually getting admitted to hospitals. There are lots and lots and lots of people that experience a impact event, some sort of acceleration, deceleration event, and they are suffering the symptoms of that insult, but they don't actually get into a hospital setting. So I would say these numbers are pretty dramatically underreported. And again, that's from the CDC. So there's some non-traditional causes, and it was actually Dr. Kirk Parsley that made me aware of some of these situations. Working with the military, I became aware that these folks would use these things called a Carl Gustav anti-tank round. And this is one of these things being shot, and I don't know if you can see, but when this thing goes off, there's a huge concussion radius around there. Can you guys see where the soil has just been completely blown out of there? So I believe Doc Parsley this morning said that the brain of the person firing the Carl Gustav is experiencing upwards of 200 Gs of acceleration from the concussion wave going through the brain. The guys on the side, if you notice, they've figured out where the lowest points of impact are. So just through trial and error and probably just kind of looking around at where this thing is going off, then they've figured out where the lowest points are. But the guys sitting near the person firing the Carl Gustav are upwards of 300 Gs of acceleration from this shock wave coming out of the gun. The folks that developed this recoilless rifle system, they recommend that folks do not shoot more than 2 or 3 of these a month. And some of the SEALs that I've worked with, in the operations that they've done, I've known a platoon of SEALs that have shot 2,000 or 3,000 of these in a weekend. And so the problems, I'll describe some of the problems that we'll see later, which they're interesting in that they look a lot like all the problems that we face day to day with metabolic derangement, all kinds of hormonal dysregulation. The issues are diffuse and very, very difficult to treat, and the way that they're classically treated are horrible. They really don't do anything much to help the person. So this is blast overpressure is generated from the firing of weapons and may cause brain injury. I'll show you another example of this. If only all the weapons that we sold were used that effectively throughout the world. So yeah, so that was a fatal location being near a recoilless rifle being launched. Okay, so long-term complications due to traumatic brain injury, sleep disturbances. And I'll talk a little bit about what my understanding, and again, a lot of this I've learned from Doc Parsley in the couple of years that I've been hanging out with him. But sleep disturbances are endemic in folks who've suffered a traumatic brain injury. So police, military, fire, athletes, and the problems. So let's look at all of these things. We have sleep disturbances, cognitive impairment, dementia, mood alterations, hormonal dysregulation. These folks frequently end up with super low testosterone levels, low growth hormone secretion, frequently no growth hormone secretion at all, depending on the severity or the frequency of these exposures. We know now they become insulin resistant, the low thyroid output, deranged cortisol output. All of these things start becoming feedback mechanisms. So if you're hormonally deranged, you tend not to sleep well. If you don't sleep well, you become hormonally deranged. When you start becoming more insulin resistant, then this stuff goes on. And the cognitive impairment becomes frustrating. People can't remember what they've done. You have a 28 or 32-year-old, field officer who walks into a room and they can't remember why they're in the room. And when they go to the standard the folks that are doing standard treatment, they'll put them on Adderall, they'll put them on different neurocognitive stimulating drugs that really don't address the issue at all. And it's very difficult in that, particularly in the military, to get a good intervention, because if the folks, particularly in the special operations community, if they admit to having any type of problem, they are frequently pulled from rotation and they can't serve anymore. So this whole thing goes underground and the treatment protocols are not particularly effective. But it's just interesting how all of these things tend to snowball together, and the classical treatments are just really not that impressive. So when I was putting this thing together, I was trying to think, are there any examples in nature of critters that experience a lot of repetitious or high impact brain potentiality for brain injury? And so bighorn sheep and woodpeckers, they have amazing amounts of force that they absorb. And what I was really looking for was that, do these animals also, how do they deal with this situation? And interestingly, and this isn't going to go super deep, I promise, 2 equations, that's it. Kinetic energy increases at a square of the velocity of something moving. So if something moves a little bit faster, the energy that thing carries is much greater. And then the impulse momentum equation, force equals mass times acceleration. Acceleration is a change in velocity per a time interval. If something accelerates very quickly or decelerates very quickly, that's impulse. And that is the thing that will either slosh the brain into the back of the skull or into the front of the skull. If we stretch the time interval of that force being distributed a little bit longer, it dramatically drops the impact. And interestingly, that is the coping mechanism for these critters. Both the beak of the woodpecker and the cranial structure in the woodpecker, as well as the horns in the bighorn sheep and its cranial structure, what it does is they are highly flexible and labile, and they distribute the load or the force over a much longer time interval versus just like a brick hitting a rock. And so that's the main way that they adapt to this. I was really kind of fishing around trying to figure out if there was a metabolic adaptation that these critters have developed for dealing with this, but what they do is they avoid the insult entirely, or seemingly. So there's really not special metabolic adaptations that these animals employ. What they're doing is avoiding the insult originally by kind of the structures of the tissue that they grow for burrowing into a tree or, bumping heads together. So that was pretty interesting. And as sports in the United States have developed, particularly in American football, the gear that we have put together to deal with that really does nothing to mitigate that impulse momentum issue. The padding that we put around football helmets basically just encourages people to hit heads harder, but the deceleration acceleration component isn't changed at all, which is a lot of the reason why we still see a really significant problems with these folks. This is as technical a slide as we're going to go through this, just talking a little bit about the integrative fuel metabolism. Under normal circumstances, glucose pumps through, pyruvate goes to acetyl-CoA, we pump that through the TCA cycle. All of these membrane potentials, uncoupling protein is set up in such a way that we get a membrane potential of sodium on one side of the membrane, potassium on the other side of the membrane, and this is the fuel that kind of fires all of our metabolic engines. If this gets interrupted and we're just reducing things to lactate, this whole internal machinery grinds to a halt, uncoupling proteins are initiated, and that membrane potential is lost. And this is how apoptosis occurs and the terminal membrane depolarization happens. We have a really slick way of bypassing this, though, and that's with ketone bodies. We can plug beta-hydroxybutyrate directly into the TCA cycle and bypass this whole operation. And a really interesting feature of traumatic brain injury is that the neurological tissue, the brain itself, when it's subjected to an injury, becomes very insulin resistant. So not only could you have hypoperfusion, low blood flow to the area, but just the tissue itself is unlikely to take up glucose if there is glucose available. So there's multiple layers where the brain ends up being in a kind of a dodgy situation once it's been damaged if we're just relying on glucose. But if we can plug in some beta-hydroxybutyrate, a ketone body, then we have a really viable alternative fuel source that prevents all of that apoptosis, the loss of membrane depolarization, and ultimately the cell death. We can basically bypass that. So in my argument, there's a couple of different ways, interestingly, to manage traumatic brain injuries. And this was really surprising to me. But in the acute stage of traumatic brain injury, there's actually some literature that indicates short term, like within the 24 hours of the traumatic brain injury, that if the individual undergoes sleep debt, that there's actually some hormetic stress kind of issues that occur there that help prevent some of the long-term neurological effects and also help deal with the acute effects of the traumatic brain injury. It was really surprising to me. But there's some arguments within the treatment protocols to actually keep people awake within that first 24-hour period to help mitigate some of the long-term effects. Oh, and you know what? There was another piece to this, and I forgot to put it in here. So usually when folks go into a hospital setting, particularly an emergency room setting, they will be put on some sort of an IV drip, oftentimes a lactate ringer solution. There's another thing called a ketone ringer solution, which instead of providing lactate as a fuel substrate, they provide ketones. And there's some great research on this out of Japan in particular, and it's not widely used. And I would argue that from an acute emergency care standpoint, particularly in our police, military, and fire, we should have ketone ringer solutions available, particularly for the people serving these situations. And if somebody is suspected of undergoing some sort of a traumatic brain injury event, they should receive a ketone ringer solution because we're providing that alternate fuel substrate to keep the brain healthier under that acute situation. I forgot to do that slide. I thought I had this thing wired, but I did not. So in the chronic stage, we really, really have to manage sleep disturbances. So this is kind of the juxtaposition. There's some argument in the literature that in the acute stage, we may want to sleep deprive people for somewhere around like 24 to 36 hours. But then in the chronic stage, one of the most problematic features of traumatic brain injury is sleep disturbance. So we need to really look at how we manage that. But Ambien and most of the pharmaceuticals that are administered for sleep issues, they don't induce sleep, they induce unconsciousness. And what we need to do is find functional medicine interventions, getting vitamin D levels up, making sure that magnesium-calcium ratios in the body are good, possibly using 5-HTP as precursors for serotonin and melatonin, maybe even using low-dose melatonin to help people sleep. There's a whole functional medicine approach to helping folks sleep that can be very beneficial in these situations once we head into the chronic situation. Also, MCTs and ketone esters. I was privy to some research that DARPA has been doing, very heavy for the military, looking at ketone esters as a way of boosting ketone concentrations in the blood without somebody being on a ketogenic diet. And I think everybody has probably seen some of this stuff where folks are still able to eat a reasonably high carbohydrate level, but they supplement with a lot of, say, like coconut oil or MCT oil, and then they're able to produce appreciable or therapeutic levels of ketones in the blood. So these are definitely some things that need to be used for folks over the long haul. And again, this stuff isn't really all that controversial when you look at the literature. It's just not being widely utilized. This clinical review, ketones and brain injury, that's in critical care. It's a phenomenal paper and really gets into the biochemistry of the ketosis for traumatic brain injury if you want to geek out on that. So we have a great case study, great for a story, not so great for the kid involved with this. A 22-year-old young man who's a member of my MMA school, and 2 years before I met him, he had suffered traumatic brain injury, slipped on some ice, fell and hit his head. Pretty serious injury, was hospitalized from that, and he was diagnosed with this thing that basically means that we don't really know what's going on, but we're going to give it a name. It's called recurrent concussion syndrome. And whenever he would do some sort of hard glycolytic-based work that was longer than what you would do just lifting weights, more intense than what you would do from say, running at an easy pace, when he did work that was really burning the glucose, the glycogen out of his muscles and dropping his blood glucose, he would have an episode where he would just go completely catatonic, possibly pass out on the floor. And what I noticed is that it looked incredibly similar to somebody who was having a hypoglycemic event. We would get him a piece of fruit, get him to eat the fruit, and he would start feeling better almost immediately. But it was really crazy because this 22-year-old kid, you would be having a conversation with him, he would be looking right at you, and then you'd come back 5 minutes later and he's like, I don't remember talking to you at all. So it was some really significant, under the hood issues. We managed to finally get him in to get an MRI, and I'll show you guys the MRI. The MRI is indicative of someone who has a 56-year-old brain because of the shrinkage of both the frontal and the occipital lobes in the brain. He had significant cognitive testing that kind of confirmed all this. He was placed on anti-seizure meds, Keppra, which is pretty nasty stuff, and he was up to 3,000 milligrams a day, and he was not himself at all. And it really wasn't addressing the issue that he had. The mechanism that Keppra works on is not at all addressing the mechanisms that I would argue is just basically that this young man had significant inflammation in the brain, which was causing reactive oxygen species, which was causing insulin resistance, and he wasn't getting that a fuel substrate that could fuel the brain and allow it to heal and prevent further damage. So like I said, he had a huge change of life issues. So normally, the way that the frontal lobe looks is more rounded here. So he has significant decreases in the frontal lobe, and all of this should largely be filled through the back. So some really, really, you don't want that ever, but you particularly don't want that type of stuff when you're 22 years old. So what this shows is there's still active inflammation in the brain. So this is, doing cross sections this way through the brain, looking at what's going on. And this little section right here was particularly troubling because it's indicative of an ischemic event. He had a stroke as part of this whole manifestation, and that was probably a good part of some of the kind of behavioral issues that he was having. He just was not himself at all. And again, the conventional treatments are not particularly impressive in the outcomes. So I had him work with our dietitian, Shante Wolf, at the Specialty Health Clinic. These are the macros that we put him on. Because he was still pretty active, if you notice the protein is reasonably high, that's a little bit higher of a protein allotment than what you would give a more sedentary person on a ketogenic diet, but it seemed to be working pretty well with him. High fat, pretty low carb, moderate protein. Caloric load was around 2,100 calories a day, so it was actually a little calorie restricted, just trying to get a little bit of that hormetic stress response to try to get some anti-inflammatory action going on in his body. We used a lot of MCTs, coconut oil and butter as kind of his main fat sources to try to goose the ketogenic effect. And the only exercise that we would let him do was just lift some weights, fairly low repetitions, and then very low intensity aerobic activity. Why would we do that? Versus, say, like doing CrossFit. No, not so much the no stress, but the stress wasn't tapping into the glycolytic pathway of the body. So he wasn't, like an 800-meter sprint, doing CrossFit, doing wrestling or something. Those things demand a lot of glucose, and no matter how you try to fuel that event, it's still going to drop blood glucose levels, and this was something that we were trying to avoid in maintaining really consistent blood glucose levels and make sure that his blood ketone levels were quite high. And you can get, by training people very, very hard, even if they're ketogenic, you can get a rebound hyperglycemia because the body goes into stress and the liver will be pinged by the adrenals to release glucose out of the liver. And so you can actually have people that are eating low carb, they can be ketogenic, but they can end up with high blood glucose levels because of stress. And we see this a lot in the kind of CrossFit scene. So the ketogenic diet result, dramatically improved cognitive testing. His memory and recall is dramatically improved. He had an eye stigma that has largely resolved since going on the ketogenic diet. He's going to get a follow-up MRI in June, and so I'm going to do a follow-up blog post on that, and we'll see what the MRI looks like pre and post. The Keppra has been titrated down to 1,000 milligrams a day from 3,000 milligrams, and he's just an entirely different person to be around. Totally different changed affect. Now, also maybe an important takeaway with this is that there are a lot of conditions that have some features that are very similar to traumatic brain injury that are very, very costly to all westernized societies. Parkinson's, there's about 1 million people in the United States with diagnosed Parkinson's. Costs us about $14 billion a year to deal with this. And again, our generalized treatments are not very good. Alzheimer's, there's about 5 million people in the US. There's an estimation as high as $220 billion dealing with Alzheimer's disease complications. And it's, clearly modifying diet and lifestyle would prevent a lot of this, but once people have gone this far down the disease process, we're really not in a large scale way implementing things like a ketogenic diet or an anti-inflammatory nutrient-dense diet to try to address these issues. And they're simple, they're effective, and very, very cost-effective compared to what we're looking at with other alternatives. Immunology of traumatic brain injury, a prime target for Alzheimer's disease prevention. So this was a great paper that I tracked down, drawing parallels between the traumatic brain injury event and the disease process due to Alzheimer's. So there's some great parallels that we can look at from this stuff. So hopefully, the traumatic brain injury thing is definitely something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I think it's very, very important. I think it's very costly. But to some degree, this talk was a little bit of smoke and mirrors to just get people thinking about the tools that we use in this ancestral health scene. So I'm going to ask you guys if there's any controversy about how you would deal with this situation. What do you think the issue is there for Captain Kirk and everybody on the Starship Enterprise? One of two things. Either this is the universal sign for choking, or Richard Nicolai has got the whole crew eating 8 tablespoons of resistant starch a day, and they're farting so much that everybody's about ready to die. So, kind of one or the other. So, if a person is dying of choking, is there really much controversy on the treatment? I guess if you're low intervention, then you wait until the person is passed out, and then you do a tracheotomy, and then you're high intervention, then you do a Heimlich or something. But there shouldn't be a lot of controversy about using the tools that we have available to us. Chris Kresser and I were actually just talking about this a minute ago. There seems to actually be a lot less prickliness about the idea that people need to individualize this paleo ancestral health model this year versus last year. Last year, there was just like this prickliness around this concept. And I guess us beating this drum pretty hard for a year has actually won some benefits, or the people who are still prickly about it are just less vocal or something. But it's just really important to understand, from my perspective, that we have more tools, we have more access to things that work than we've ever had before. And we have the ability through the social networks that we create to really share some amazing information and to be able to compare notes and find ways to really significantly help people. So, it's just, I think the TBI story is important, but possibly the more important story here is to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we have amazing tools at our disposal, and let's start really utilizing those tools to treat these issues that are incredibly costly but maybe don't need to be. So that's what I've got for you. Thanks. That's the first talk I've given that I finished on time, too. So.
All right, we've got a question. Anybody have a question?
People are like, I just want to go home.
Is it on?
So great talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Anyway, how would this model perhaps work like an autism spectrum? Perhaps there's some similarities, obviously not the same, but some of the models of the glycolytic pathway, and the oxidative pathway being shut down and so forth.
I see Dr. Walls nodding her head back there, and she's nodding very vigorously, and I'm kind of thinking I'm not entirely. I think that there's definitely situations. I think that it's a gimme that if we are at one substrate level, say like carbohydrate intake, and we're dealing with a neurological condition and it's not responding favorably, then a just gimme place to go is to either restrict carbohydrates or introduce medium chain triglycerides and try to get blood ketone levels up to a therapeutic level and just see what happens. Like that seems like an absolute gimme, in addition to, pull out these immunogenic toxins, gluten being kind of the biggie, eggs for some people, dairy for other people, like there's an autoimmune paleo protocol plus a ketogenic intervention. Like if we have some sort of neurological condition that's just not budging with basically cleaning up the diet, then this seems like an obvious place to go. And maybe it works or maybe it doesn't. But the interesting thing to me is that usually on these ketogenic protocols, if the issue has been inflammation and or substrate depletion, like we don't have enough substrate feeding the brain to keep it healthy, and we're maybe getting some apoptosis and some inflammation from that, if we provide that ketogenic substrate, that process stops like immediately. It's like flipping a light switch. So it seems like a really low-risk intervention, but with high potential reward. So that seems like a win to me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So as you know, Rob, I'm a traumatic brain injury survivor who I think after last year, after coming to this, I was like, all right, I'm trying the ketogenic diet, and dove into it, and I've been doing so ever since. But I think more the kind of saying where I'm increasing the fat a lot, but eating plenty of other stuff as well. So what really surprised me was the sleep debt in the beginning, in like the acute stages. It's helpful to keep brain injury survivors, you know,
For only about
wait?
24 hours.
Really?
Yeah, and there's only a little bit of research I tracked down on that. Doc Parsley's in the audience. So Doc, what do you think on that? The acute phase of TBI, keeping the person awake. The papers I tracked down seemed to indicate that there was kind of a hormetic stress response that seemed to mitigate things, but it was a really narrow window of time to keep the person awake and get some benefit from that. Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I
But-
would love to see all the, see your notes and articles where your research came from, because it's all very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. My
for
pleasure.
the presentation.
Yeah.
Cheers.
I have a bunch of boys, and they're all into sports. Do you recommend cutting back on all of those brain bouncing activities?
I don't know. I mean, we just had this like finding the well-adjusted male panel this morning, where we need to be like rough and tumble and everything. I mean, here's one thing within that, and it's probably not really going to be a good answer ultimately, but there's some great literature showing, and maybe just kind of common sense also, but if kids aren't allowed to do certain levels of dangerous things, they never really learn to risk assess at all. And this risk assess, it's like my daughter Zoe is at a point where she's just now starting to figure out that jumping off of that might be a problem. Jumping off that bottom step, not a problem. So, something that surprised me is that physical risk assessment actually goes into risk assessment at large. Like, is it dangerous for me to, overspend on my bank account, or to drive a car fast, or it's really kind of interwoven in our psyche. And so it's that initial rough and tumble play that teaches kids kind of some interface with the environment. And so if kids don't have a dangerous situation that they're ever exposed to in an adaptive way, when they're faced with a really legitimately life and death situation, they literally may not have the wiring to be able to make a good decision about that. So we have to expose the kids to a risky environment to allow them to survive a riskier environment, is kind of the takeaway that I get from that. I would almost argue that rugby is safer than American football, because with American football, like John Welborn says, you put your helmet on, it becomes a weapon, and you try to spear people with it. Whereas like rugby, there's some head impact, but it's not the same way at all. There would probably be a whole lot less initially there would be horrible head injury, because these guys would still be playing the same way, and then they would learn that really quickly. I remember I used to do Thai boxing, and I was also an EMT, and a guy had gone through the windshield of a car at a car accident. We took him in, and they were doing a EEG, and I asked the neurologist, I'm like, when is his EEG going to go back to normal? And he said, well, imagine a crystal chandelier that falls and hits the floor. He's like, when is that ever going to go back to normal? And I was like, oh, okay. And then the next day I went to my Thai boxing coach. I'm like, I'm done. I'm doing grappling, and I'm done. So, I mean, but there again, boxing taught in a safe, progressive manner in a good gym is probably pretty safe. Becoming a professional boxer, maybe somewhat less safe. I know for a fact I had some concussions from Pop Warner football. Like, looking back, I'm just like, clearly I had some concussions. So, yeah, so I don't know. But I think that, it's really important for kids to have some sort of an interface with the world where they learn about risks and danger, and they're able to assess that. And then from there, you kind of do the best job you can, which really isn't a good answer. So I don't know. I'll tell you this, Pop Warner football makes me a little nervous now looking at that stuff. I would almost be more inclined to get my kid into boxing from a really good boxing coach, where I know that this stuff is in a pretty safe, controlled environment versus, I remember when I played football, all I wanted to do was hit people on the other team as hard as I freaking could. And even, it was all a ruse. Like, being on a team was just a ruse so that I could go try to inflict damage on somebody and use my head to do it. And that's what boys do. So I don't know that that's entirely like the best outlet for them to do that with. So I don't know.
Are grade 1 concussions, are they being lumped in as traumatic brain injuries now?
I don't know.
Because
I don't know on that.
MBTIs, right? Mild.
I do not know on that. Like, with these statistics, I'm not
Right.
sure where they're cutting those grades at. I'm not
Okay,
sure.
my second question is, do you think that, say on the sidelines of a football game, guy has a concussion, if we feed him high-grade MCT oil, will that mitigate the inflammation or anything like that?
In
Or
my
help
opinion,
recovery?
yeah. I think there's some good data, and probably even before that, I think there's really good data from emergency medicine from some other countries that administering a ketone ringer solution would be a pretty good argument in that situation. Yeah. You could maybe even make an argument that, if say like you are a kickboxer or you do play rugby or something and you just get your bell rung really good, you go ketogenic for a couple of days, a week or something after that. And ketogenic may just be that you really up your MCT oil during that time, get a ketone meter and kind of monitor that stuff. I think there's some really good argument that likely would benefit you, and there's no real downside I can figure out about that, unless you overdo the coconut oil and you are dashing to the bathroom. So
I just want to ask a question.
yeah, and Doc Parsley had a comment too.
My stepson had a concussion in October, and he's still not normal. And should he slow down his usage of computer games and watching too much TV to help his brain really heal?
Doc's nodding, yes. I mean, that excitatory piece is tough. So, like, part of what needs to happen is the brain just needs to go down into like a sleep mode, literally, like a system off mode, so that it can heal, and all of that stimulation is feeding into some of the problem. Like, just simply thinking, like doing math problems is an inflammatory event in your brain. Playing a video game or doing virtually any type of activity is a mildly inflammatory event in the brain, and that's typically good. That's part of how learning occurs. But if you are already in a pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory state, then you may be exacerbating and continuing that problem.
I was just going to say, for their question about post-concussive treatment, if you can get past the FDA and DEA, the most effective thing that's been shown is growth hormone.
Interesting.
A supraphysiologic dose of growth hormone increases the repair by about 40%, the rate of repair. Yeah. For what period of time? I'm sorry? Well, they depend on the severity, but probably only about 3 to 4 weeks.
Hi. I currently take 125 milligrams of Keppra a day, and I'm interested in the ketogenic diet. However, I'm taking the Keppra for epilepsy. And are there negative health effects to having ketogenic diet long term?
Doc Parsley is shaking his head no.
Versus, the risk of having the grand mal seizure, which I don't want to have. I understand that it does damage the brain.
Yeah, some of the best research that we have on the ketogenic diet is in the epileptic scene. Stanford University has had an epileptic ketogenic diet ward since 1920, 1930, something like that. So it's actually super well studied. You need to find the right doc to be able to kind of work with you on that. But typically what the person does is they would go on a ketogenic diet, establish a therapeutic range of blood ketone bodies, usually like 1.5 to 2.5 millimolar, and then you would start titrating down on the Keppra. And clearly you need a doc that you're working with and doing that. But again, there's great, still to this day, the most effective treatment for epilepsy is a ketogenic diet. And it's interesting, a lot of neurologists will just dismiss it and they'll say, well, it's too hard to do, and they don't even provide it as an option for folks. And a lot of people won't do it. They're not willing to change dietary practices. They're not willing to weigh and measure their food to figure out the amount of protein and carbs that the kid actually can take in and still be in a ketogenic state. But I mean, it just works amazingly well. And we have some great mechanisms kind of showing why it helps prevent a variety of neurological conditions and help to reverse that situation.
Okay. Second question. Also, the body as it gets addicted to any kind of medication takes, right? Even Keppra. So, are there withdrawal symptoms from? There's like an increased.
You
risk of
definitely want to
having
titrate
seizures,
down.
right? Okay.
Yeah, you just
Very
don't stop
carefully.
taking Keppra
Okay.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, slightly off topic, but pot has been shown to prevent seizures, and they're coming up with a way to extract. I
Yeah,
forget
the
what
hemp
it's called.
oil extract. Yeah. Yeah, and there's some really interesting stuff with that. So what about using that in conjunction with a ketogenic diet? Like there's some great information suggesting that would be really helpful.
If someone has a severe concussion, how many years can that affect them afterwards? Forever.
Potentially.
And can the symptoms just be kind of mild and then get worse later, or is there really? Okay.
Yeah. And that's part of the problem is that this stuff can go kind of subacute and then, I mean, within weeks, the person could start getting hormonal dysregulation and sleep dysregulation, or it could be months or years later that it was just in this kind of low-grade issue. But if we had that continuing level of inflammation in the brain and a bad diet and poor sleep and low vitamin D levels, so we never really got the healing that could have occurred. And even with the, depending on how severe the event was, even with the ketogenic diet intervention, like ketone ringer solution, the sleep deprivation, we're doing everything that in our ideal situation we would hopefully pull out and do. Is that enough to really affect as much change as you would want? Doc Parsley and I were talking this morning, like somebody suffers a car accident and they've had 3 pins put in their leg and they're like, well, I'm back to 100%. And it's like, not really, I mean, there's amazing ability to heal. We can bounce back from a lot of stuff, but there's also a reality of like wear and tear. And so, there's just huge variation on that. My argument though is that we should do everything that we can, because we certainly don't want it to get worse than what it potentially is, for sure. Yeah.
I know after the first 24 to 48 hours of a brain injury, about half the brain cells are microglial cells, which are the immune cells of the brain. And it shows that a low-calorie diet right after the first 24 to 48 hours is really good at attenuating that immune response. What do you think about that for a low-calorie perspective initially?
It's straight out of this. I guess so what you're doing is you're mitigating the inflammatory response, which is good. We're not really providing an alternate fuel substrate, though. Yeah, long term, and even in the short term, like during that inflammatory state, the state of ketosis is a pretty anti-inflammatory condition, and particularly in a situation where you have tissue that is insulin resistant, and when the brain is damaged, it's insulin resistant.
Are there additional supplements you'd want to add in, like alpha GPC, things like that?
Oh, man, I don't know. That's definitely out of my pay grade. I don't know. Yeah, Doc, would you? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, that's definitely out of my pay grade. I didn't go looking at the supplementation side. Yeah. But what are some great insulin sensitizers? Like alpha lipoic acid, making sure your vitamin D status is adequate, and some basic things like that. Which also vitamin D then attenuates immune function. So I mean, this is where like an ancestral model really starts dovetailing together to provide some great direction about where we could go with this stuff. Yeah.
So when I go home to Alabama and I'm talking to my friends who play rugby and stuff, or if I play a match, is there anything you can do like beforehand if you know that you've got a higher than average probability of actually getting a call on the head? Is there anything you can do like maybe go maybe lower carb, really anti-inflammatory, or even keto, before a match, maybe a day or two before a match, to kind of clamp down on the inflammation, and so that the response you do get if you do get injured would be more normal or ancestral? I don't know.
I mean, any type, if you are less inflamed, it seems like a good situation to be in. So you're well rested, vitamin D levels are good, you're insulin sensitive, like those all seem like good things to do. potentially throwing in like some MCT oil around that event seems like a pretty safe deal. I mean, if you suffered some sort of a traumatic brain injury in that situation and you had ketone bodies available, it seems to make sense that it would help mitigate that situation. But I mean, yeah.
Anyone else?
Folks have got to want to go drink a NorCal margarita here soon. Oh, I do.
If somebody suffered a TBI but also suffered damage to their brainstem, which is causing like numbness and a sensation of fire to their extremities and maybe like inability to walk, can they benefit as well? Like on a similar note, can they benefit as well from looking into this kind of protocol and experimenting with it?
I mean, any type of neurological tissue is going to respond similarly. Again, like that's an area that I didn't look specifically into, like brainstem versus the brain, but you have the same basic inflammatory mechanisms and whatnot, so I would assume so, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, and I just want to do a quick shout out to Shante Wolf, who, unrelated, but one of my partners at the Specialty Health Clinic, he's the one that implemented this in this young man. He's a phenomenal RD, also he's intimately involved in the development of the cert that we're working on. So he's an amazing guy, and you'll see a lot more from him. No, I don't. I wish I did. Soon, hopefully. Yeah. Thank you guys for coming. Thank
Robb
you.
Wolf.
Yeah, thank you.